Before we get started, there's so many things happening at the church. If I forget things, please understand it's from negligence. It's not from intentional negligence. It's just I'm forgetful. And in this case, one of the things that we didn't mention last week, which I think we should have, was the Sibes, Tammy Sibe and, well, Mark, but Tammy's father passed away. And so just be in prayer. And I don't know if it was in the RB Connect or not, but just be in prayer for them. And for the rest of the folks here. Some of the things you'll never hear about, but people struggle. It's life, and life is not easy. But so we're carrying on in the book of Acts, and we're into chapter 14, and we come to the end of the first missionary journey of Paul. So let me read 14, verses 8 to 28. Now at Lystra there was a man sitting who could not use his feet. He was crippled from birth and had never walked. He listened to Paul speaking, and Paul, looking intently at him and seeing that he had faith to be made well, said in a loud voice, "Stand upright on your feet." And he sprang up and began walking. And when the crowd saw what Paul had done, they lifted up their voices, saying in Lycaonian, "The gods have come down to us in the likeness of men." Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. And the priest of Zeus, whose temple was at the entrance to the city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates and wanted to offer sacrifice with the crowds. But when the apostles, Barnabas and Paul, heard of it, they tore their garments and rushed out into the crowd, crying out, "Men, why are you doing these things? We also are men of like nature with you, and we bring you good news that you should turn from these vain things to a living God, who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. In past generations he allowed all the nations to walk in their own ways. Yet he did not leave himself without witness, for he did good by giving you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, satisfying your hearts with food and gladness." Even with these words, they scarcely restrained the people from offering sacrifice to them. But the Jews came from Antioch and Iconium, and having persuaded the crowds, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing that he was dead. But when the disciples gathered about him, he rose up and entered the city, and on the next day he went on with Barnabas to Derbe. When they had preached the gospel to that city and had made many disciples, they returned to Lystra and to Iconium and to Antioch, strengthening the souls of the disciples, encouraging them to continue in the faith, and saying that through many tribulations we must enter the kingdom of God. And when they had appointed elders for them in every church, with prayer and fasting they committed them to the Lord in whom they had believed. Then they passed through Pisidia and came to Pamphylia. And when they had spoken the word in Perga, they went down to Attalia, and from there sailed to Antioch, where they had been commended to the grace of God for the work that they had fulfilled. And when they arrived and gathered the church together, they declared all that God had done with them, and how he had opened a door of faith to the Gentiles. And they remained no little time with the disciples. Okay, so let's do a quick recap geographically for you as far as what's happening in this missionary journey. So let's get the map up. So here we go. There's 16 different Antiochs in the ancient world. We're only talking about 2 of them. So Paul and Barnabas leave from Syrian Antioch in Syria, and they cross over to Cyprus. We talked about this previous weeks. They make their way through Cyprus, and after that, they sail from Cyprus north to Perga. It's actually Attalia, which is a port city, and then they travel 12 miles up to Perga. They go directly from there over the Taurus Mountains into Pisidian Antioch, a different Antioch, in the province called Pisidia. And then from there, at chapter 14, where we begin, they have moved from Antioch, because they were chased away, as often is the case, into Iconium. And then from there, they head south into Lystra, and then into Derbe. And once they hit Derbe, after they're done preaching there and making disciples, they turn around and retrace their steps to go home, except they avoid Cyprus this time and just sail directly to Antioch. So that's the first missionary journey. Now, this passage, there's so many things you can do. This is one of the struggles of being a pastor, is there's so many different ways to preach it. But let's avoid just talking about the journey itself and instead see what is it that the gospel here calls us to. Because we see Paul and Barnabas, and specifically Paul's kind of the star, if you want to use that language, or actually God is, but Paul's the human star here. And when you look at it, you begin to see what it was he was called to and how he was able to actually be the sort of guy God called him to be. And so what we're going to do is we're going to see this for ourselves as well. We're going to learn that when we, as not just us, but all human beings are called by the gospel. That's one of the things he says there. When he says, before, God had let nations do what they wanted. See, because if you read the Old Testament, there's very few prophets, in fact, only a couple, that are ever sent to nations that are not Israel. So God is very clearly in the Old Testament concerned with building up and growing Israel and teaching them to be the people he wants them to be. And at the time, there was no direct revelation to other nations, meaning he didn't send prophets, he didn't send them scripture. He was content, if you want to use that language, to let them go their own way, though they should have known better, as Paul says, because there was rain and crops. They should have realized, as Romans 1 says as well, that there was this good God who loved them, and they should have responded to that. But up until this point, that isn't the case. Up to this point, God isn't out there calling all the nations to repent directly. But now that the gospel has gone out, this is what Paul's saying, now there's no excuse, because now as the gospel goes to every person, as Tanner shares the gospel with every student at Brock, they're now left without excuse because the gospel has now come to them directly, and they have to make a choice. And so the gospel calls to all humanity and asks that we do, well, many things, but in this passage we're going to see three things. It calls us to make an exchange, to endure something, and then to expect something. So let's walk through that and see what it is that the gospel is calling us to. So first, the exchange, and this happens in verses 8 to 18. So let's recap again. Paul has moved from Antioch to Iconium, and that's the first 7 verses, which we didn't read, of chapter 14, because, well, I'm not going to focus on it this week. But what happens is pretty typical. Paul goes to Iconium, he preaches, he does miracles, things seem to be going well, but then the crowds turn against him, and they uncover a plot against Paul and Barnabas, so they flee and head due south to Lystra. And so when they get there, they see this cripple in the street. And what they do is they heal him, and it causes a big ripple, because when he is healed, the crowds realize it, and then they start to worship Paul and Barnabas as Zeus and Hermes. Not surprising, because in the old Greek myths, when the gods decided to become incarnate, they would often be strangers, and they would be known because they'd go into these towns and they would say, hey, who are these strangers? And the strangers would do miracles, and they would speak with a loud voice, and they would stare at you, because remember, the Greek gods have black eyes, right? They stare. The eternity of the Greek gods would be in their eyes. And so when Paul shows up and he's a stranger, and he's staring at this man, and he's speaking loudly and commanding and doing miracles, it's understandable that they think he's one of the gods incarnate. So they begin to worship him. And sensing this blasphemy is coming, Paul offers a plea. It's not really a sermon, but it's more of a plea. He's trying to stop them from worshiping him. And what he says in verse 15 is important. He says, men, why are you doing these things? We also are men of like nature with you, and we bring you good news that you should turn from these vain things to a living God who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. And so what he's trying to tell them, he's basically telling them, you have to exchange something here. You have this tendency to chase after vain things, and you have to exchange those vain things, which are empty things, that's what the word means, these empty things, and instead turn from those and turn towards this God, the real God, the only God. And so what he is essentially saying is, you must turn from empty things to things that can actually fill you. And so what he is doing very directly is he's saying, stop being idolaters. Stop chasing things that you think will fill you but cannot fill you. And there hasn't been really an improvement on a definition of idolatry since Augustine, 1700 years ago. He says idolatry is worshiping anything that ought to be used or using anything that is meant to be worshipped. And so what's going on here, and with all humanity when we idolize something, is we are expecting something that is empty to fill us. And that is exactly what he is getting at here. And what's interesting about this is that we all kind of know about the word idolatry. If you're a Christian, you've heard it. And it's easy to spot the overt idolatry of people, because we can say, oh, they're idolizing their fame and their money and their reputation or their position, those sorts of things. We can see that. But there's an insidious form of idolatry that is far more subtle that we all have. And I'll just use a couple of examples because there's many. One I heard this week was when somebody says something like, I know God has forgiven me, but I can't forgive myself. Now, that's a very common and relatable statement, but it's idolatry. And the reason it's idolatry is because in that moment, you believe that something other than God's forgiveness is more important than God's forgiveness. You're saying, I know God has forgiven me, but what I really need is my forgiveness of myself, which in other words means you have become God. Your opinion, your approval, your forgiveness is more important than God's. And yes, we can sympathize with it, but it means it's idolatry nonetheless. We still think that we are greater than God, and that's why I need my forgiveness or your forgiveness more than God's. And there's other ways, and we see them in so many. I mean, how many of us come and we love church, but what our heart really sings to do, what we really would rather be doing is golfing, or, I don't know, fill in the blank with whatever you love to do. And that doesn't mean it's bad to like other things, but when you love something and cherish it and yearn for it more than God, it's become an idol to you. And so, and it goes even much further. And Tim Keller has this wonderful book called The Counterfeit Gods, which you should all read. And in it, he says this: what many people call psychological problems are simple issues of idolatry. Perfectionism, workaholism, chronic indecisiveness, and the need to control the lives of others. All of these stem from making good things into idols that drive us into the ground as we try to appease them. Idols dominate our lives. And so what Paul's saying is, stop looking in empty things to be filled, including himself and Barnabas. He's saying, we cannot fill you. It's impossible. And so what he says right after is actually important, because he says, turn from these vain things, which makes sense, turn away from the idol, to a living God who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that's in them. So you see what he's saying? Look at the language. Turn from the empty thing and turn to the one who's filled everything, one who's created everything and then filled it. Because only the one who has filled everything can possibly fill you. And so he's calling them to make an exchange, a radical exchange. And we have to be sympathetic with new believers and people who are struggling on the fringes, because this is a radical worldview change. Because all we're told all of our lives, especially here in North America, is that other things make us full. Other things will give us peace. And it's any number of things. In fact, we do it as parents without even thinking, right? Because we tell our children, without even knowing, that the narrative you should follow with your life is go to school, do good in school because you want to get a good job, because if you don't have a good job and a degree, you're out of luck in this world. So you want a good, stable job. And if possible, find yourself a good man or a woman, right? And then once you have that, have kids, settle down, start saving for your retirement, right? And all this time, as C.S. Lewis says, we work from young age to middle age. And in middle age, we feel like we're doing something because we feel we're making our way in the world. Yet all the time, the world is making its way in us. And it's becoming an idol to us. And so Paul is calling them to a radically different thing. So we need to be very patient with people who have become Christians, knowing they're going to struggle, because it's a big deal. In fact, we should be patient with all of you, and myself included, because we struggle. We're imperfect. And so, what he says, and this is why Paul does it, because he understands something about idols. That idols are not just empty, but they have a very simple mantra: serve me or die. That's what an idol cries. And if you're a skeptic, which I was, I can hear the answer of them saying, but isn't that what God does? Isn't that what Jesus is saying? If you don't serve him, you're dead, you're in hell? Isn't that, so is Jesus an idol? Now, no, and this is why. Here's the difference. And this hopefully will help you forever and ever. There's idols and God and Christianity. All other religions, basically, and Christianity, operate on two very different ways of understanding salvation. And so they basically work on these two forms. Religions and idols will always work on an if-then paradigm, and I'll explain this, whereas Christianity operates on a because-therefore paradigm. And so idols and other religions will always invariably say something like, and we'll put up on the screen, if you serve me, then you'll be saved. That's what an idol says. If you put in the hard work, then you'll get the recognition you're longing for when you get the promotion. If you put the work into your children, then they'll be good Christians when they grow up. If you put all the work into your Instagram account, then you'll have followers and you'll feel like you've got something. You see, so they demand you first serve and then get paid out. Christianity, however, doesn't work on an if-then paradigm, and yet I know it's been preached this way and still preached this way in far too many churches. What the gospel actually says is, because Jesus died, therefore you have life. Because other religions, every single other religion will always say, obey and then be saved. Christianity says you're saved, now go obey. And that makes all the difference in the world, because an idol will drain you and rob you and rob you. And I remember working in a corporate job once, and we had to cut, 86 employees were cut. And one of them was a gentleman who worked out east, and he had worked for the company for 30 years. And I remember him talking to me saying, "Could you believe they treated me this way? They just cut me loose after this?" And I said, "What did you expect?" You knew, and we knew, because I had talked to him. What he had always been doing with his life was, how do I get promoted so I can make the most money with the least responsibility, right? That's what we do. I get that. And I said, so you treated and you used the company for your own gain, and now they've done it to you, and boy, you hate it. And I understand you hate it, and yes, it is unfair, but what did you expect? Because that's what idols do. They'll take and take and take, and they'll leave you empty. Christ, however, does the opposite. So Paul is saying, stop. Put down these vain things, the things that can't fill you, and find the God who can, who's filled everything else. So he calls us to an exchange. Every Christian, every human is called to make this exchange. But then we're also called to endure. Now this is painful, because we're called to endure and persevere in following Jesus. Not just following like him, but all the things he went through as well. And so in this passage, you see Paul having to, and Barnabas, but again, Paul's kind of the highlighter, has highlighted. He's having to follow Jesus and endure through suffering and in ministry. So I'm going to explain those two things, because we're all called to these two. And the first one is suffering. Now, Paul, it must be difficult. I mean, we are, as Christians, you're kind of persona non grata here in Canada a little bit, but you're not really hated the way Paul was hated, or the way Christianity was hated at that time. And it's not the same way, because Paul has now left Antioch and Iconium because he's being chased out because they want to kill him. And then when he finds himself in Lystra, he finds those people have followed him at great expense in an ancient world to follow him from these cities and to go and sabotage his ministry in Lystra. Because whether or not they hated Paul or they hated his message, it didn't really matter, because it amounted to the same thing. Because they wanted Christianity gone, and the simplest way to do it was to kill Paul. And so Paul is hunted, and so is the gospel. They follow him into Lystra, and they rile up the crowds. They stone Paul. Assuming he's dead, they drag him outside of the city. Now, we're all called, well, none of us, I hope none of us are called to be stoned. That's not quite, we're not there at this point. But we are called, and this sounds harsh, but it's true, we're called to be hated to an extent, because the world simply cannot abide God. It can't. If it could, it wouldn't have needed Christ to die for it. And so the world cannot abide God. Therefore, it cannot abide people that look and smell like God. And so Hudson Taylor, wonderful little missionary, he's passed away, of course, says, carrying the cross does mean following Jesus in Jesus' footsteps. And in his footsteps are rejection, brokenheartedness, persecution, and death. There are not two Christs, an easygoing one for easygoing Christians and a suffering one for exceptional believers. There's only one Christ. Are we willing to follow his lead? And so, if you never are treated differently because of your faith, it's possible that you've just been graced by God. But it's probably because you actually haven't lived as Christ did. Now, don't feel bad. Most of us don't. And yet, if we are Christians, the world should rub against us. The gospel will never be popular. And so, whether you attend Redeemer or any other church, stop trying to make the gospel popular. It's never going to be. I've peeked at the end of the Bible. It doesn't work. Right? The gospel's never going to be popular. It's always going to be resisted so long as humans only create sinful creatures. And that's all we do. And so, the goal is not to make it popular. It's to proclaim the truth of it and trust the Spirit to do its work, his work. And so, Paul does this. Now, the only payment Christians can expect to get, J.C. Ryle, old Bishop of Liverpool, laughter, ridicule, opposition, persecution are the only reward which Christ followers get from the world. And here's what's remarkable about how Paul endures the suffering. He not only endures it, but he then goes back to those cities. He's in Derbe and he has to get home. Now, on one hand, it's the simplest way, because to go around would have been very difficult because there weren't roads, etc., very dangerous. But he chooses to go back to those cities that really had literally stoned him and wanted him dead. And he doesn't just tiptoe through and say, nothing to see, nothing to see. He goes in intentionally to encourage the churches that are there. And that's sort of, what is it? How can Paul possibly do it? And the reason is he accepted that the only payment he was going to get for his work and for his calling was that sort of behavior. He knew the only thing he could expect from the world was resistance. That's all he could expect. And so he said, I have a couple of options. I could either embrace it or I can reject it. And he chose to embrace it. And there was there was a Romanian pastor who was imprisoned for 14 years by the Soviet government. His name was Richard Wurmbrand. You may have heard of him. And in it, here's what the things he says. It was strictly forbidden to preach to other prisoners. It was understood that whoever was caught doing this received a severe beating. A number of us decided to pay the price for the privilege of preaching, so we accepted their terms. It was a deal. We preached and they beat us. We were happy preaching, they were happy beating us, so everyone was happy. Now he's got a tiny book called Tortured for Christ, and it's brutal. So the fact that this is just astonishing. How is it that Christians do this? Not just Richard Wurmbrand, not just Paul, but all through the history of the church, including to this day in many parts of the world. Because it's not glamorous. Now, we're not here promoting it. Nobody's saying it's glamorous to suffer. Nobody wants to suffer. And yet, they're so committed that they know it's the plight of the Christian to suffer. And so when it comes, although it hurts and they're angry and they cry out to God, they are not shocked by it. They shouldn't be. We shouldn't be shocked by it. So, yet we're called to endure this suffering, but we're also called to not just endure it and just take it like a turtle, but instead to continue in the calling that God has given us. So continue in the ministry. And so what we see is that Paul believed somehow that the lost and the churches that he was planting, they had more to lose by him not preaching to them than he had to lose by dying. He was under the impression, and rightly so, that his life was less important than them hearing the gospel. And that is important. It's almost mind-boggling. And it's because of this. The enemies threatened death, but God promised life. And so the question was, which one rings louder in your heart and in your life? Is the threat of death or the promise of life the one that dominates your choices in life? And listen, this is not to heap guilt on you. If you didn't fear death, if you weren't weak, Christ wouldn't have needed to come. So it's fine to embrace it and confess we need God. But it's also right that we say, but I don't want to be that sort of a person. I want to be the sort that trusts the promise so much that I know that even if I die, it means eternity for me. But if they die having not heard the gospel, it's eternal death for them. So the gamble is simple. They have more to gain than we have to lose as Christians. And that causes Paul to behave very differently. This is why he goes to these cities, these churches he's planted. He encourages them. He says to hang on to the faith I've given you, which means he's taught them doctrine. He's taught them who is God, how do you know he's different from other gods, how to pray, what is God, what did Jesus come to do? He taught them doctrine. And then he says, hang on to that doctrine. And he prays with them, and he encourages them, and he strengthens them, and then he leaves them elders, and he leaves them with leaders before he goes. And so Paul thought this was more important than his own life. So he's called to endure not just the suffering, but to carry on the ministry. That's why he endures, because Christ is worth it, and it gives him the opportunity to continue to do the ministry God has called him to. So we are all called to similarly endure suffering and endure in the ministry as well. That whatever we're called to. And now let's move to the last point. We're called to expect. See, the power to do all this is found in this expectation that comes in Christianity, that comes with the gospel. And so when Paul returns home, last few verses of this passage, he returns to Antioch and he reports back to them. And what we read is in verse 26, at Antioch, he had been commended to the grace of God for the work that they had fulfilled. Now, listen, the word commended is the word to be handed over. So in other words, what Luke is saying about Paul's this. Paul's been given a calling to go out and to grow the church, to share the gospel among the Gentiles. But the ability to accomplish that was not in Paul's work alone, or in fact not even primarily, but God's. Because his calling had been commended to the grace of God for the work he fulfilled. In other words, this success of Paul's ministry and his missionary endeavors was not rooted primarily in Paul's efforts, but in God's grace to accomplish what he said Paul would accomplish. And this is important because Paul understood that he was, although vital, he had to do all the hard work we do. We have to do the hard work that's called to us. But he knew that his success was actually God's and not his. And this is why he says in verse 27, when they arrived, they gathered the church together. They declared all that God had done with them and how he had opened a door of faith to the Gentiles. And so, do you notice the beatings, the conversions, all of it, he doesn't say was at the hands of sinful world. God had done this with him. God had permitted it to happen. God used it, just as he used the suffering of Christ to bring about good. And Paul was so certain that God was in control, that he was sovereign over this, and he would accomplish it, that he trusted and expected God to do it. And this is why he does something really incredible. I think maybe the most astonishing part of this whole passage is earlier when he left those churches, after praying for them and giving them elders and installing elders, it says, he committed them to the Lord in whom they had believed. Listen, these are brand new churches. We know in Lystra, this was a backwater town, kind of considered to be, well, it was a military outpost at first. It was trouble to Rome. It was poorly educated. They were brutes. Most, if not all, were pagans. We don't hear of any Jews being in that city. So here's a church of people who have never heard of God, the God of the Bible. They've been converted, and now he's turned some of them into elders to lead the rest. And then he walks away and says, I'm going to trust, I'm going to commend you to God. You don't need me any longer. Now, I've been in church planting. I've been involved in these organizations and here with our denomination as well. And I assure you, when we plant a church, we don't do that. There's a long umbilical cord. There's 5 years before you have to be financially stable, all these things, and there's nothing wrong with doing that. But why is it that Paul could just walk away and say, I commend you to God? Was he a jerk? No. He simply understood something. That's God's church. I commend you to the God who planted this church. And therefore, you're actually, and this is the hard part to believe, especially for parents, it's difficult to believe that, for Paul it must have been, that church is in better hands with God than it was in his own hands. And for parents, this is hard, especially if you have parents who are not serving God. Can you actually believe that they're in better hands when God is watching over them than when you watched over them? That's very difficult. And I'm not saying it's easy. This is why Jesus says it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven. Faith is difficult. It requires not just giving God the overflow, it means giving him everything, including your children, including the church, including trusting that when I remember when I got here a few years ago, I took the signs down that said you couldn't have coffee in here. Boy, I got an earful from a couple of guys for that. How could you do it? Listen, and I understand. God, it's God's building. It's God's church. This place will open or close when God says so. And it's hard to get there. But Paul, the reason he could do this, why could he do it? Why could he expect all this? How could Paul be so self-forgetful, so willing to hand over his hard work that he literally sowed with his blood, and to hand it over and say, fine, God's going to look after it? How is he able to do it? Well, it's a small quote. There's a guy named Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. He wrote Little Prince. Remember that little book, Little Prince? He says, if you want to build a ship, don't summon people to buy wood, prepare tools, distribute jobs, and organize the work. Rather, teach people the yearning for the wide, boundless ocean. And so, the gospel, when the gospel comes and the penny drops, and God has given the gift of faith and people actually believe, what he does in us is he implants this yearning for the wide and boundless eternity of God. And we recognize in us the wide and boundless gaping hole that we have. And we fill it with other things continually. And Paul is saying the gospel is the only thing that is wide and boundless enough to fill it. And so Paul, having been filled in that way, is able, because he yearns so much for the next world. You know that old saying, they're so heavenly minded, they're of no earthly good? I understand that. That could be possible. But I'll tell you what, the Christian men and women who have done the most for Christendom over the history of this world have been the ones who have been most heavenly minded. are so focused on the next world that they realize that their desire is to try to drag something of the eternal and the perfect world of heaven into this world. And that's what allows people to fight against slavery, right? And fight against injustice. It's not because they're social justice warriors, it's because they recognize, if they're Christians, the perfect heavenly situation, and they want to drag it down here as best they can. And Paul understood something of this. The promise of eternity, coupled with the grace of forgiveness, massaged in each of us by the Spirit, makes us able to exchange, endure, and expect. And so there's two things. Closing. Skeptic, stop seeking empty things. If you're not a Christian, you know that you have a wide and boundless yearning in you. Stop trying to fill it with things. It's not going to work. Fill it instead with the one who fills everything else, Christ. And if you're a Christian, we're not called to just endure and to follow Christ in suffering and in ministry. But if we follow Christ, we follow him as everywhere he's gone. And where is he gone? Into glory. And so we have this hope of glory that is laid before us. And so we follow him. And I'll just end by just reading the last, I don't know what verses they are. And I should have told the worship team I was going to do this because I'm sorry, you're not singing the song, but you're welcome to just ad-lib it. Amazing grace. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. 'Tis grace that has brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. The Lord has promised good to me. His word my hope secures. He will my shield and portion be as long as life endures. Run to this God. I can't even stop it. Stop trying to fill yourself with other things. Stop it. Anyway, let's pray. Oh, Lord.